Welcome to Brain Atlas. First, we're going to be talking about learning, memory, and emotions. Chapter 4. First comes H.M., who is a notable person. H.M., also known as Henry Molaison, was a person who experienced seizures as a result of a childhood accident. And at the age of 10 is when these seizures started, and these got more aggressive until the age of 20, when his hippocampi from his medial lobes were and temporal lobes were removed because that's where the seizures were happening. And after that, he got relieved of his seizures, but he couldn't make any more new memories. Note the part that it says new memories, but he could remember old memories. So this is a map of what we were supposed to talk about today. So types of memory, there are two types, declarative and non-declarative. And in declarative, there's working memory, semantic memory, and episodic memory. In non-declarative, there's learned skills and habits, which is basically non-declarative doesn't have any subtypes. And so working memory is controlled by a brain region, semantic memory is controlled by a brain region. We'll be talking about this now. So, first, declarative memory records facts, data, and events on a timeline. This is the type of explicit memory and is part of long term memory. And so, semantic memories, a type of declarative memory, records knowledge, ideas, and things about the world, like culture. This is controlled by the cortex. Episodic memories record personal experiences like recalling a person or place with emotions associated with it. So this is controlled by the medial lobes and the hippocampus. So parts of the brain involved here are the amygdala, parahippocampal region, hippocampus, and prefrontal cortex, which are all important in processing any type of memory. Amygdala controls flight or fight responses, basically immediate responses. Parahippocampal region encoding the what of memories. Hippocampus records like is the main storage of memory and decodes the where and when of memories. Prefrontal cortex controls attention, decision making, and planning, long term planning specifically. So, next we're going to be talking about another type or other two types of declarative memory. Spatial memory actually does not fall into a different category, it's spread out throughout the three categories: semantic, episodic, and working memory. Working memory basically records short terms of memories and lets us remember something for like a short amount of time. And this is controlled by the prefrontal cortex. Spatial memory records spaces and areas or like shapes and that stuff. Non declarative memory now. This is procedural memory and it mainly composes of learned motor skills, and this is controlled by the amygdala for motor tasks, cerebellum, hypothalamus, and sympathetic nervous system for emotions, and the basal ganglia for habits. Synapse and memory. So we have some vocabulary for this. Synaptic plasticity is the remodeling of synapses, like there is neuronal plasticity where neurons are like remodeled. Same thing here, except with synapses. Presynaptic neuron is the sender of the signal. So remember when we talked about in the first video that a neuron passes a signal to the next neuron through the axon terminal and it reaches the other neuron through the dendrites? So the sender at the axon terminal, that place is the synapse. The space between the two neurons is the synapse. The presynaptic neuron is basically the sender of the signal. So the signal goes from the axon terminal of the sender or the presynaptic neuron, and through the synapse, that's where action potentials occur. After that, it goes into the next neuron through the dendrites into the postsynaptic neuron, which is the receiver. Next, we have a sea slug that we analyze because it has few and large nerve cells. So we can zoom in and analyze what nerve cells actually look like. And this sea slug is called Aplysia californica. Another thing to know is NMDA receptors and CAMP response binding protein CREB form long-term memories. And there are two types of long-term potentiation and depression, whatever you call it. LTP is long-term potentiation, basically the long-lasting increase in synaptic strength. LTD is the long term depression or the long lasting decrease in synaptic strength. They are opposites, basically. So now let's talk about LTP. This is the timeline of this is stimulus activates the NMDA receptors. Calcium enters the postsynaptic neuron. So basically, in the action potential that occurs in the synapse, calcium enters through the calcium channels into the postsynaptic neuron, ready to go to the after coming through the presynaptic neuron. And then next, CAMP, cyclic adenosine monophosphate, is activated, and this activates two options. It activates enzymes and synapses become more sensitive, or it activates proteins, CREB, and genes. PTSD is a well-known disorder which is caused by a trauma or a harmful memory. PTSD is basically post traumatic stress disorder. And so this can affect the person's mental health. And so now LTP is being studied because there is a possibility to eradicate or erase harmful memories that cause PTSD. Or in another case, if you have dyslexia or inability to learn properly, then long term potentiation can be studied or research to be modified so this increases the learning capacity in our brain. Now let's talk about the last topic for today, emotions. So this is a part of non-declarative memory, and there are six types: anger, fear, surprise, disgust, joy, and sadness. Amygdala, insular cortex, and periaqueductal gray are involved. Prefrontal cortex, amygdala, and insular cortex sends neurons to the periaqueductal gray, which then sends what the amygdala needs. And then the amygdala controls the emotions and the classic conditioning, which associate two habits, or operant conditioning, which associates habit with the reward or punishment. And this also interprets fear. So there's each part of the brain interpret a different type of emotion. So amygdala controls fear. Insula, or the insular cortex, controls disgust, like disgust toward spoiled food. The periaqueductal gray is important with pain, and this is the home of pain relievers like morphine and opioids that we talked about in our previous videos. Motivation is another main emotion, which isn't considered as a type of emotion, but a combination of emotions like joy and surprise. Dopamine is the main center of reward and punishment, so this is where operant conditioning happens. And the mesolimbic pathway, or the reward pathway, extends from the ventral tegmental area to the nucleus accumbens. And so that's where the dopamine goes through. And for example, when you eat a piece of candy, that activates dopamine, which gives you pleasure, like we talked about in the previous video with Parkinson's disease, which has a lack of dopamine in substantia nigra. Lateral habenula is basically there to encode punishment by inhibiting dopamine release. This is actually a disorder, and this basically does the opposite of dopamine, and it just inhibits the dopamine from doing what it wants to do. So for example, people with lateral habenula would experience punishment or some kind of disadvantage by eating candy, if even if they like candy. Thank you for listening.